begin. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this event. This is the second Jaroslavsky lecture in human nature and technology. It's a lecture series sponsored by the Jaroslavsky Chair in Human Nature and Technology. Thanks for being here. If I had known, we planned the event a couple of months ago and we didn't know if we would be allowed to have an in-person event. But we said, well, maybe we will. And so we booked a small room. We would have booked a larger one had we known, but it's very good to see you here in person. And it's a hybrid event. So many persons that are attending online. We'll be recording the session. It's not going to be put on YouTube or made public. It's just for teaching related reasons. So some of the students in my political philosophy in the digital age course have to write a commentary on Simone's talk, and maybe some of them can't attend. So that's why we're recording it. For those who don't know me, I'm Jocelyn McClure from the philosophy department here at McGill and the holder of the Jaroslavsky Chair in Human Nature and Technology. As I said, this is our second lecture. The first one was given by Marcus Gabriel, a German philosopher, in December. It was on human nature in the digital era and on the differences between human intelligence. This lecture series is made possible by and the creation of the chair was made possible by a very generous gift by Stephen Jaroslavsky and the Jaroslavsky Foundation, and I want to thank them for the creation of a chair dealing with some of the philosophical questions raised by advances in science technology and especially in digital technologies. So today we'll have a lecture on political philosophy or political theory on the character of our democratic life in the digital age. Want also to thank Kevin Bisson and Julian Da Silva for helping me out, or rather I helped them planning this event out. So thank you for that, guys. Many of you, of course, already know our guest today. Simone Chambers is a very well-known and influential political theorist, now the chair of the Policy Department at the University of California, Irvine. She used to be at the University of Toronto, heading the Center for Ethics there. I have very fond memories of a short stay at U of T. That was in 2004. I spent a semester there as a postdoc just before I started at Laval University, and the discussions that we had on public reason and discourse ethics and digital democracy were quite formative for me. So it's a pleasure to have you with us today. So that was in 2004. Back then, of course, we couldn't really anticipate all the different transformation of the public sphere brought about by the digital technologies, Internet 3.0, the social media, and so on. So it would be interesting to see how Simone's view evolved in consideration these quite radical transformation of the public sphere. Simone is an outstanding political theorist, really one of the pioneers with regard to the development of the field of research in democratic theory, but more specifically on deliberative democracy. I remember that I engaged quite seriously with her 1996 book, Reasonable Democracy, Jürgen Habermas and the Politics of Discourse. So that was back in 1996, and she since then contributed with many important papers and books on theory. And now she's working on a new book, provision titled The State of Contemporary Democratic Theory. So maybe she will talk. As I said, this is a hybrid event. After Simone's talk, she will talk for about 45-50 minutes. We'll have a Q&A session. And of course, we'll turn to people who are following us online. The event is live streamed, so we'll also those of you who are at home or wherever you are to follow this, you also get to ask questions or comment on Simone's talk. So I think that's it for me. Simone, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Well, thank you, Jocelyn, for the invitation to present my research. It's always lovely to come to Montreal, especially in a March day like this, which as a Montrealer, I know this is not a usual March day. I also would like to thank the Jaroslawski Chair for sponsoring this talk. And also for being at McGill, which is, I have to say, my favorite institution of higher learning. Okay. So a lot of them. Today, the title is Wrecking the Public Sphere, the New Authoritarians' Digital Attack on Truth and Pluralism. This is a co-authored paper with Jeffrey Kopstein. And the idea really came to Kopstein and I a while ago. 20 years ago, we wrote a paper called Bad Civil Society. And in that paper, we kind of pushed back against people who were saying, all you need is like an active civil society, lots of associations, and this was good for democracy. And we pointed out, well, it depends on what those associations are doing. If they're full of anti-democratic, or white supremacists, then it's not, or Nazis, it's not really good to have an active civil society. So at first we thought we were going to write a paper called Bad Public Sphere with all the kind of toxic things that are going on the internet. But as we started thinking about it, working on it and researching it, we really came to a different conclusion. Like that paper 20 years ago, this is a bad actor kind of scenario. That is, we were talking about individuals with ideologies behaving badly in democracy. But unlike the first article, this article really takes a different approach. So this was really conceived about 1.5 years ago, and it's only kind of finished now. It's going to be published. And so maybe the moment is gone, and maybe what we're saying here is not going to be as surprising. But when we first thought about it, what we really came to realize is that people were being obsessive about platforms and algorithms. This kind of terror in the air about platforms and algorithms. And we really thought this was really more of a political problem of bad actors. We have 2 claims in the paper, and the first claim is that, succinctly it says the dangers to democracy posed by new information technology have more to do with political bad actors intentionally targeting democracy than with either the technology itself, that is the algorithms, or the economic forces driving the developments and expansion of that technology. So this is our first claim. And then our second claim has to do with who are these bad actors? And we call them the new authoritarians. And new authoritarians are people who are really interested in undermining democracy from the point of view of authoritarianism, but they do it within liberal democracies. So it's not so much the Putins, although the Putins have, created the model, but it's more the Bolsonaros and the Trumps. And here, our argument is, and this is our second claim, that the internet has opened up possibilities for authoritarians and autocrats to flourish and gain power within the constitutional democracies because they can effectively wreck the public sphere rather than suppress the public sphere. So wrecking the public sphere, the idea of wrecking, this is a technical term, that is to be understood as suppressing the public sphere. So the argument here is that the certain developments in digital communication have made it possible to wreck the public sphere without destroying the public sphere. Parts. In the first part, we channel a little bit of Habermas and we talk about what is the public sphere and what is the threat of disinformation in the public sphere. In the second section, we talk rhythms, and we give what we call a kind of good news story there, which we get a lot of pushback on this good news story, but I'll try it out on you. And then in the third part, we give the bad news story, and that is authoritarian strategies of disinformation and why that it can't really be addressed through technology or platform regulation. So it's a bit long, so I'm just going to talk through some of the main points of the first section and then maybe read sections of the second and third section. So the public sphere, we have just a very loose, as I say, semi-Habermasian definition of the public sphere. It is, we understand it as a sphere that is wild and unstructured and contains multiple forms of political communication. Communication is highly mediated and disaggregated and ranges along a vast multidimensional continuum from everyday talk to formal deliberations, and includes growing numbers and varieties of digital platforms. So this is the idea that between civil associations and individuals and the state, you have this sphere of political communication. So we argue that the public sphere, as we understand it, performs three functions. The first function is simply as a place for people to get information. That is, it performs a function of opinion formation, where information circulates and citizens find out what's going on, and finding out what's going on, they develop judgments and opinions about events of the day. The second is that the function of accountability, and this is the idea that it's in the public sphere where you get arguments and pushback against states and asking for public accounts and justifications, and then a function of responsiveness. We're also in the public sphere, you get demands for action the state to respond to concerns in civil society. We are in a kind of lexical order. That is, the opinion formation function, that is the basic information function, comes first. That is, if citizens don't have information or have wrong information, this has effects on the accountability and responsiveness function. Well, a couple of things about this model. The first is that I am known for working in deliberative democracy, but I would like to stress that we do not, in this paper, we do not consider the primary function of the public sphere or the problem with, say, social media is a problem of the lack of deliberation. So, high-end deliberation is what you would really love to see in your public sphere, but we're actually interested in the floor, that is the minimum, and we're interested in citizens having basic information. The vast majority of people who are on social media are consumers of information, not producers of information. So we're interested just in people getting facts and information, not in the question of whether or not you're going to have, actually, people for deliberation. It's never going to be a place for deliberation, but it is a place where a lot of people get their information. So we're interested in information. The second thing, we articulate these functions. These are ideals. There are no, public spheres that actually live up to these three functions perfectly. There are all sorts of pathologies. But more and more people are thinking that the digital transformation of the public sphere has now made those functions even more problematic, that is even more difficult to fulfill. And so we talk about ways in which the digital transformation of the public sphere or the digital transformation of parts of the public sphere, how it is undermined. We basically come to the conclusion in the first section that it's about disinformation. It's really about basic information. It's not about this echo chambers. It's not about putting people in silos. It's not even about being the home for extremist groups. The biggest problem facing democracy is if citizens really don't have basic information to develop minimally competent judgments. So, and we think that when citizens don't have the right information, this has four kind of reasons. So the first is that simply they don't have information to make minimally competent judgments. The second problem is that uncertainty about the trustworthiness of information. That is, people don't know, even if they want to get information, they don't know where to get information. And you see in survey after survey that across all ideological views, across all liberal democracies, everybody is worried about the security of information. That is, everybody is worried about truth. Everybody is worried about sort of truthfulness. So this will make people hesitant and worried about the information they do have to make judgments. The third problem is when citizens are confident that they have sufficient information to make competent political judgments, but this information is in fact false. And here, what you see then is that the information is false, and then there's demand for accountability and responsiveness. So for example, citizens who have false information about COVID ask governments for policy responses, which of course are based on falsehoods. This is the third problem. And then the fourth problem, which in some ways I think is it more serious? I know it's the one that worries me the most, and that is the potential of erosion of trust, not in information, but trust between citizens. That is, here citizens worry, and some of course are convinced, that large segments of the population do not have the information needed to make minimally informed decisions. So here, even staunch supporters of democracy with access to fact and evidence-based information will lose confidence in democracy if they think that large numbers of their fellow citizens are in the grip of delusion or brainwashed by propaganda. You see this also in surveys that ordinary citizens are beginning to worry very much about their fellow citizens, but you also actually see academic versions of this. You see the rise of defenses in epistocracy, for example. So these worries of the digital age have fed a new philosophical attack, I consider it, on democracy through these defenses of epistocracy. The second section, we say, okay, so there is a problem of disinformation if citizens don't have access to like basic facts. And what kind of a problem is it? And you know, what are the platforms doing about it? So this is the section which is called the good news, which the subtitle is knowledge mobilization and platform self-regulation. So I'm going to read some of this just so I don't, you know, go off on a tangent and keep you here for 70 minutes. So it's worth pausing and reflecting. This is one of the things I say all the time. So Facebook was launched, and you actually mentioned it today, right? So we were talking about the public sphere and public reason, and like, we weren't talking about the digital, right? So, I mean, Facebook was launched in 2004, but many internet experts and communication experts really say the media landscape and domination of, say, social media did not really take hold till 2012, right? So that's 10 years ago. But honestly, the alarm bells really started going off across the globe and only in 2016, and that's only 6 years ago. So it's worth remembering this, that we are at the front end of the latest structural transformation of the public sphere. So the fact that we haven't actually solved it all now, we shouldn't be too panicked about it because we are actually at the beginning of this. 2016, especially the US election, but also Brexit and other political events across the globe, shocked even the most detached observer and consumer of media. The revelations about fake news, disinformation campaigns, Russian bots, micro-targeting, voter suppression, the amplification of crazy conspiracy theories, the role of Cambridge Analytica, and the complete failure of most platforms even to know what was going on, let alone to step in when they were raking in the profits. All this and more added to a crisis moment. In the immediate aftermath of 2016, there was a certain amount of what we call techno-dystopian defeatism about what this meant for democracy. Post-truth was the 2016 word of the year, and we saw a great deal of alarm and despondency about the competence of citizens in a digital age. But something else began to take hold in 2016. There has been an astonishing and unprecedented explosion of institutes, centers, programs, think tanks, NGOs, academic studies, and research devoted to assessing and studying the new digital landscape across all domains, from the humanities to the hardest of hard sciences. Money and resources have poured in from public and private sources to support work and research in this area, with particular concern for the epistemic crisis of the digital public sphere. The flood of research and study has been paralleled by an equally constant stream of discussion and reflection in the popular press disturbed by post-truth. And I think this shows a number of things, but it shows a kind of near universal acknowledgement that were the public to lose access to trusted sources of truth or fact, this would be a total disaster for democracy. So this really unprecedented knowledge mobilization is, for me, actually a positive sign, right? That there is widespread concern and widespread investigation of how we actually get some form of a grip or handle on the situation. Pouring out of every university, think tank, center, and institute, nor all the initiatives to oversee and regulate the new information ecosystem. We do note, though, that one already sees significant changes in levels and type of disinformation between 2016 and 2020. If we compare the disinformation campaigns in the 2016 election to the 2020 election. Facebook itself may be reluctant, for example, to come clean about the impact of its past implication in the practices of bad actors and bad civil society. But state and local governments have been chipping away at the power of big tech, paving the way for what may be big changes in the years to come. So we do predict that, sitting here in 6 years or 10 years is just going to be a completely different conversation about how we understand platforms and digital communication. Inauthentic networks dominated the 2016 fake news crisis, but we have gotten very good at uncovering these as well as exposing bots as amplifiers of misleading information. But as we sketch below, 2020 misinformation campaign had a very different profile. Algorithm-curated filters are being subject to ever more transparency and publicity. Practices of upranking more radical and sensational materials to keep users' interests has been exposed and in the last few years meaningfully altered. Big tech is slowly approaching its own big tobacco moment, with the exposure not only of its algorithms, but the fact that its own covered up internal research demonstrating the potential pernicious effects of its platforms. We do not want to overstate the role of social media platforms as either uniquely good or bad in this story. Between 2016 and 2020, there has been a significant readjustment, what we call actually a self-regulation on the part of social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube in response to the growing problem of misinformation. We would not say that this is the result of civic mindedness, but rather four types of pressures. The first is the worry about real regulation, that is, social media platforms do not want to be regulated or subject to reclassification as publishers. And so they want to show that they can handle the problem. And what's really important here is that they do acknowledge that disinformation is a problem. And the bad actors that we discussed in the last session do not acknowledge this problem. They acknowledge that disinformation is a problem. And they claim they can handle the problem and do not need to take the state to step in. This is particularly true in the context of the United States. They have launched several initiatives, hugely expanding fact-checking operations, crowdsource authentication algorithms like Birdwatch, publicized oversight ethics committees, revamped privacy safeguards, review and enforcement of community standards, content moderation, and some move to discuss and make transparent information curational algorithms. These are some of the developments just since 2016 in a scramble to project the appearance of responsiveness. It is certainly to some extent a public relations rear guard action, but the level of scrutiny and concern from so many sectors of society suggests that some of this activity is making a difference, even if the motivation is not civic but profit. Pressure on platforms comes from users and public shaming campaigns. It is not at all clear that Facebook is too big or too large to fail. The digital market moves fast and it's large. TikTok has already passed Facebook in the most downloaded app in 2021 and has overtaken YouTube in video streaming metrics. WhatsApp, a messaging, not a social media app, but a powerful misinformation tool, is way bigger than Facebook. These are just some of the biggest now. But the digital market has hundreds of platforms connecting people via information on social networks. And every year, hundreds more join. So Peloton, right, is a social network in which information is shared. So this is, as I say, a very fast-moving market in which, and everybody is concerned with this information. And this means that platforms, to some extent, users and their users concerned about this information. Third element pushing platforms to address issues of disinformation is the internal pressure from employees. Many of these companies have recruited people who do not fit the standard corporate profile. Both Twitter and Facebook have seen internal pressure to step up and become better corporate citizens. Despite tough non-disclosure agreements, disgruntled employees from lowly design engineers to top executives have been exposing questionable decisions and unethical design choices in the way that the platforms curate information or fail to enforce their own standards. So this is a quote from 2019 from a Facebook researcher. He says, "We are knowingly exposing users to misinformation, and we have the processes and resources that we have the processes and resources to mitigate." And most of our information we have about the internal problems in places like Facebook are from employees coming forward. Are not immune to bad citizenship and failures to self-regulate. But even if these pressures are nudging platforms into better practices, self-regulation is not the answer or not the full answer. The power and problem of self-regulation was on full display at 4 p.m. January 6, 2021. Jack Dorsey's decision to deplatform Trump was the right decision and probably as important as calling in the National Guard in avoiding more violence. But it's quite mind-boggling, however, to think that a private citizen sitting on an island in French Polynesia as having the power to thwart an insurrection or a coup attempt, whatever it was. The response to the assault on Congress has been wide-scale exclusion from social media of those thought to have instigated and incited the violence. But the decisions to deplatform have taken place in corporate boardrooms rather than in legislative bodies or state regulatory agencies. And although many have defended these decisions as important short-run responses to threats against democratic institutions, given the centrality of social media for political communication, this yields too much power to corporations. But even without strong or coherent state regulation in the United States, the 2020 US election saw a decrease in fake news. So here we're understanding fake news as inauthentic actors masquerading as legitimate news outlets to spread lies and conspiracies. This was a kind of one of the main ways in which disinformation was spread in 2016. You know, it's the teenagers in Macedonia. Social media embedded disinformation campaigns. So that algorithms were doing a lot of the heavy lifting. This was due in part, but since 2016, we've been able to actually get a handle on many of these tactics. This was due in part to government policing and the engagement of science and technology, and a demand for more transparency in the algorithms that curate information and news. And finally, a user base that has become more aware of the possibility, indeed likelihood, of disinformation getting into one's newsfeed. So I really would not discount education between 2016 and 2020. Nevertheless, there was still alarming levels of disinformation in 2020 election. But rather than algorithms and hidden trolls doing the heavy lifting, in 2020, the disinformation was elite-driven through Donald Trump and Fox News. Remember, Fox News is a network news source. It's not a social media platform, playing outsized roles. Of course, Trump's lies were amplified by Twitter. Many Facebook users passed on Fox News items. But this suggests that Twitter and Facebook are megaphones for lies and not destroyers of truth. The ability to get a handle on and control over the sort of disinformation circulating in 2016, but not in 2020, points to the role of bad actors positioned in places of political power pursuing anti-democratic agendas. So now I turn to the bad news. Bad actors in the question of ASIN. We have argued that knowledge and research combined with transparency and regulation have the potential to bring some of the systemic causes of information pollution under control. In this case, human agency can press back against technological structures. One might think, therefore, that an even more efficient strategy would be to track down bad actors and deplatform them. Go to the source. It is more efficient to track down one person who can reach millions rather than chase down millions of messages as they speed through the internet, and fact check and correct them as they spread. And deplatforming Trump seems to confirm this assessment. And this has been the strategy for fighting hate and extremist groups, and this approach will most likely continue to intensify. And of course, we do support the tracking down and deplatforming of extremist groups. But it's not clear that this is or can be an effective strategy regarding disinformation. Trump was not deplatformed for telling lies. He was deplatformed for fomenting violence and extremism. The result has been a tremendous decrease in disinformation, but this is a side effect, and in any case has become a game of whack-a-mole between platforms and malign actors. Once deplatformed, bad actors search out new platforms, and although they face formidable collective action and coordination problems, the larger the group of those deplatformed, the more likely they are to stumble upon a new method of mass communication. Legal recourse through defamation and libel lawsuits can only have a very small impact on disinformation, as the cases that could fall into this category are few and far between. But there's a really super important case coming up at the Supreme Court against Fox News, brought by Dominion voting machines, and this is going to be a game changer if they side with Dominion, which everyone says would be be very unlikely given, anyway, I'm not going to predict. But it's just it's a small weapon, not a big enough weapon. Furthermore, they will run up against free speech concerns. Indeed, the common argument against a policy of seeking out and shutting down the purveyors of disinformation has been the issue of free speech. But we may need to look at it another way. The most serious threat to democracy coming from the digital public sphere is from agents who explicitly and knowingly seek to undermine the public sphere's three democratic functions: as a resource of opinion formation, as a platform for critical accountability, and by extension, as a venue for responsiveness. Although technology and science can expose the manipulation of information, and law may regulate and occasionally punish misbehavior, ultimately, this is a political fight. Voting Trump out of office was decisive action, not deplatforming him. Indeed, it is questionable whether Twitter and Facebook would have deplatformed Trump at all had he won the 2020 election, but continued to spread lies about COVID-19 and incite civil unrest directed at his opponents. These considerations indicate the problem of bad actors intent on disrupting the three democratic functions of the public sphere as far thornier than that of technology itself. We turn now to the means, strategies, and tactics used to wreck the public sphere and by extension undermine democracy in the current era. These tactics exploit digital communication, and one might want to go so far as to say that the digital landscape is a boon to authoritarians within democracy. But these strategies are chosen by agents intent on undermining democracy and not the result of impersonal technological imperatives. The strategies we canvass below are all very familiar by now, but they are no longer the exclusive tools of foreign powers. You know, Russia, China, and Iran, those are the three biggest sources of misinformation in democracies. They are also the tools of domestic forces within democracies that seek to weaken democracy. So we go through 5, I think, strategies. So the first one is frontal attacks on democracy. Perhaps the most obvious attack on democracy over the past several years in the United States has involved active attempts to corrupt the vote process. Some of these attacks on the franchise by, for example, purging voter rolls, making it difficult and onerous to vote, hobbling the get out the vote campaigns in ways great and small, like outlawing, like not allowed to give people water who were waiting in line. This one could add various attempts to have legitimate ballots thrown out or go uncounted. Most shocking, of course, has been the use of violence to stop the certification of elections at local and national levels. Less dramatic, but no less important, however, has been the concerted reputational damage done to voting and elections in general through misinformation and disinformation mediated in the public sphere. In fact, voter suppression and election challenges carry the force they do because of the mendacious public narrative claiming voter fraud where there is none. It is the latter which legitimates the former. None of these actual attacks on voting process could happen if citizens didn't believe it. The first is the disinformation campaign, and it's only the second that is the actual action. After 2020 presidential vote, tens of millions of Americans continue to believe the election was stolen. This belief was the direct result of an elite-driven misinformation campaign designed and thought of by elite that does more damage to the democratic order than a demand for voter ID laws or stricter absentee mail-in ballot rules. In mass democracies, the legitimacy of election depends crucially on the belief in the integrity of the voting process. And this belief is mediated by the public sphere and political communication. Elections are institutions and depend on all three functions of the public sphere, most importantly, public opinion regarding procedural integrity. Enemies of democracy know this and set out to wreck the public sphere and manipulate public opinion regarding elections in general, rather than directly disenfranchising people. Misinformation and disinformation campaigns that constitute frontal attacks on the legitimacy of democratic processes have come from abroad, but also at home. Some are large, but many are relatively small scale intrusions by bad actors to sow doubt and uncertainty about the democratic procedures. These have been termed perception hacks. For example, in 2020, Facebook took down a disinformation campaign that originated in Iran that spread the false rumor, they knew it was false, rumor that Iran had succeeded in hacking into the US voting machines and could manipulate the outcome. Also in 2020, The Russian group appeared to try to hack into voting machines, knowing that they couldn't do it, but they made the attempt. And the attack never had a chance, but officials reporting their successful thwarting of the attack only introduced more uncertainty in the public mind about the security of voting machines. Coming from Russia, there appears only one obvious purpose for such perception hacks. It is to weaken democracy by diminishing the confidence in the democratic system, perhaps keeping people away from the polls and sowing doubt about electoral outcomes. Agents also engage in similar campaigns to undermine the confidence in voting. Why would Americans have an interest in undermining and sowing doubt about the democratic system? The 2020 election and its aftermath witnessed Trump and his supporters employ just such tactics. Here, the tactics were incessantly and loudly repeated lies about state-level corruption of mail-in ballots, illegal ballot harvesting, or voting by dead people, supposed barring of Republican poll watchers from Democratic-run cities, accusations of ballot dumps, and falsified accounts of machines that had supposedly been tampered with by a company with links to Venezuela, or even, like most bizarrely, by satellites controlled by an Italian defense firm that somehow manipulated the votes. These are all like stories that have circulated and people believe them. None of these claims, of course, held up in court or to any scrutiny, but Trump and his allies continued to assert them over a year after the election in an attempt to undermine the belief in the integrity of the process itself. They know it's not true. They don't really think people are going to fully believe it, but it just introduces doubt and doubt and doubt into the system, which is the purpose of perception hacks, right? So it's trying to get you to perceive insecurities in the system. The short-term goal was to put the outcome of the 2020 election in doubt, especially as it became more and more likely that Trump would lose. The long-term aim, though, and this we claim, was the very same as that of Iran and Russia. That is, to undermine the United States democracy. This might seem melodramatic, but in the United States, but in the US, states have used fabricated fear of election fraud and interference to call for redos of electoral outcomes they do not like, to suppress the vote from urban areas, and to thwart the will of voters altogether by disempowering public bureaucracies to certify the vote. This is a disinformation campaign that is extremely difficult to address with technological fixes or algorithmic regulation. This is a political problem. Second strategy is the destabilization through polarization. Bad actors not only directly attack democracy by undermining the faith in democratic procedures, they also indirectly attack it by seeking to destroy trust and any modicum of unity among citizens. Why does this matter? Half a century ago, the early students of totalitarianism, such as Arendt and Kornhauser, pointed to the increasingly isolated individual as the raw material of totalitarianism. What they did not anticipate was that authoritarians did not need to overthrow democracy to undermine it. They could generate isolation, if not at the individual level, then at the group level, through tactics designed to exacerbate cleavages and intensify what social scientists now call affective polarization. That is the tendency for partisans to dislike and distrust one another, people from the other party. Our point of polarization, though, is not primarily a byproduct of technology, but an effective strategy of authoritarians who seek to solidify and heighten the bond between leader and follower and cut off their political insiders. One primary tactic is the use of malinformation. So malinformation is like malware, right? It's information that might actually be true or based in fact, but it is used to inflict harm on a person, organization, or country. The point is illustrated by an example. This is an example I brought up at lunch. So many of you, I said, well, you don't really need to come to the talk. You've already heard that. So Redfish, I know you follow Redfish. Redfish is a Russian-funded social media venture based in Berlin, producing English language content for Americans that showcase protest, racial inequalities, and political violence in the United States and other stories designed to divide American electorate. This is not a straight up disinformation campaign, right? Redfish does not promote stories about events that do not occur, but instead pushes incendiary stories designed to heighten and pour fuel on the divisions of American society. The site does the same for other countries. So in Europe, it's usually about immigration, for example, emphasizing what the site's proprietors deem to be the issue most likely to exacerbate existing cleavages. The goal, as one analyst put it, is, quote, to drive debate to the extremes, close quote. Redfish is not a particularly well-conceived influence operation, as several of its journalists have been employed by RT, you all know what RT is now, and it never runs critical stories on Russia. But it remains elusive as its source of revenue and political direction is really hard to pin down. In the hands of Redfish's purpose is to destabilize America and other democracies in the hope of weakening it on the global stage. But this has also been a deliberate strategy by Trump and other populist authoritarians, Bolsonaro, Orban, with intellectual democracies. Polarization is an effective strategy for reducing the probability that adherents of those harboring doubts will cross the aisle to support one's opponent. As voters in the middle to pick sides, while at the same time mobilizes the base. Trump abandoned any rhetoric of unity and regularly appealed to language and lies that heighten polarization and division. Polarization is deployed to some extent to keep the base on an emotional high of outrage, but destabilizing polarization more generally is the friend of authoritarianism because it makes the compromises necessary for effective democratic governance less likely. So the next strategy, noise, chaos, disorder, and uncertainty. Tested that information chaos is, quote, an emergent property of ubiquitously connected, always wired society over which we have no control. That is, information chaos is the kind of new reality of our digital age. We follow scholars, however, who question that diagnosis and instead suggest that chaos is frequently a planned strategy of agents seeking to disrupt information with noise, rubbish, and sheer volume. Jason Stanley points to the strategy of RT, Russia's propaganda network, and their slogan, "Question more." On the surface, such a slogan suggests an openness to many points of view and seems to be promoting the traditional journalistic goal of objectivity and knowledge. But as Stanley says, but the Russian spin doctors and media strategists discovered long ago that when you open the information space to every kind of conspiracy theory, you destroy reality. This is the distinctive nature of modern propaganda as pervaded by authoritarians, to render fuzzy the line between reality and unreality rather than imposing some coherent ideological truth. The tactic is to drown journalists and the public with noise. In this way, the ideal of journalistic objectivity is turned against itself, inducing mainstream outlets to show the other side and rendering uncertain what is the truth to begin with. Donald Trump's advisor and chief ideologist, Steve Bannon, followed the Russian playbook for wrecking the public sphere. You've probably all heard this quote like a zillion times, but in an interview in 2018, he said, quote, "The Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media. And the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit." The intention is to generate a level of I can never say this word. Say the word cacophony. Cacophony. Okay, so I pronounced it right. Cacophony. That was my co-author's word. So it's impossible to sort out truth from untruth, much less deliberate about the best path forward. And the strategy is what we call fake news. So even before Bannon said the quiet part out loud, revealing his view of the press as the real opposition and in intention of flooding the zone with confusion, Trump had taken to labeling legacy media fake news, and later turned to dubbing journalists as, quote, enemies of the people. In a rally in Kansas City in July 2018, Trump told his followers, "Stick with us. Don't believe the crap you see from those people, the fake news. What you're seeing and what you're reading is just not what's happening." The goal in all this was not to imprison or physically harm journalists. So of course, labeling them the enemy of the people does create that risk, but to retain power by undermining public confidence in any information or reports critical of those in power. It is a strategy formally, not earlier, but as form, compatible with democracy, but designed to hollow out the conventional mechanisms of the public sphere and accountability. What we are calling fake news then is the rhetorical and partisan attack on real facts, fact-based journalism, opposition, and pluralistic contestation with the accusation that it is all fake news and misinformation anyway. This narrative aims at undermining the reliability of public information and depicts the press as corrupt and biased, and journalists as evil and vindictive. We see this very clearly on Fox News that maintains a running negative commentary on CNN and New York Times coverage of everything. Here is a news outlet exerting a great deal of energy, not in reporting the news, not even in reporting fake news, but rather in undermining the credibility of other news sources. Over time, mainstream outlets have responded with their own stories of hypocrisy and subpar journalism among the purveyors of fake news in an attempt to discredit their detractors, pointing to the vaccinations, for example, to the vaccination status of journalists peddling false information about COVID-19 and so on. Such tactics, however, do not entirely solve the problem. Those wrecking the public sphere rarely feel constrained to respond, and in some ways, the mutual accusations of bad faith are the point of the exercise, to undermine public trust in the objectivity of journalism and render it another form of entertainment. The attempt to destroy the legitimacy of mainstream media and shut down all criticism takes direct aim at the second democratic function of the public sphere, democratic accountability. These tactics seek to reduce all public communication to partisan bias. Under these circumstances, there are no facts, only opinions, to paraphrase Arendt. It is now difficult to use the term fake news as it has been so thoroughly co-opted by authoritarian discourse to undermine the general trust in public information and criticism. Section on asymmetry. There is a final dimension to our claim that disinformation is more a political problem than a technical one. Misinformation spreads unevenly among groups in the population, regardless of their use of social media and other digital technologies. In the United States, and this is actually also true in other liberal democracies, large number, I mean that it's on the right more than on the left. In poll after poll in the United States, large numbers of Republicans agree that election fraud is a major concern, despite there being no credible source backing this up. Few Democrats share that belief. These polling data reflect what we knew almost immediately after 2016 election. More disinformation was and still is circulating on the right than on the left. Studies show that although the media landscape has dramatically changed in the digital age, the mainstream media ecosystem is still governed by traditional norms of truth-telling, fact-checking, professional journalism, and minimal levels of civility. Furthermore, for many people, digital literacy, nudging, and accuracy cues make them more vigilant and less susceptible to fake and false information. And everybody, even those who do seem to believe in falsehood, say that truth and accuracy are important. Nevertheless, there is a significant portion of the American population that lives in a right-wing media ecosystem that, quote, this is from Joachim Benkler from the book, this great book, Network Propaganda, quote, that exhibits all the characteristics of an echo chamber that radicalizes its inhabitants, destabilizes their ability to tell the truth in fiction, and undermines their confidence in institutions, close quote. So there was a section of the paper at the beginning that I didn't discuss or read in which we talk about the literature on echo chambers, so that echo chambers are, rather than being produced by algorithms, they are really produced by elite strategies and choices by consumers. And so echo chambers are not, they are asymmetrically distributed. And actually, for the majority of people, their digital information world is much more informationally porous than their personal information. It's really, you have to actually choose to be in an echo chamber on the internet. It doesn't just happen. Same with the idea of filter bubbles. So exhibit the echo chambers that radicalizes its inhabitants. So then back to our argument. So not polarization, then, but radicalization accounts for this asymmetry. Polarization involves a belief that having one's opponents come to power or stay in power would be the worst thing that could ever happen. Under these circumstances, politics move from being ideologically driven, you want to have platforms and policies, to being identity driven in the sense that party affiliation takes on an emotional, combative dimension that sometimes looks more like rabid fandom than a commitment to a policy agenda. Radicalization takes place when the determination to exclude the opposition from power is so intense that one is willing to bend the rules, ignore norms, and pursue strategies that would have seemed off limits under normal circumstances. Democrats in the United States are polarized, but so far they have not been radicalized to the same extent as some Republicans regarding the norms of democracy, including what I'm interested in this paper, the norms of accuracy and truth. Acknowledges this asymmetry in disinformation in the American public sphere and the weaponization of disinformation by authoritarian regimes and not by liberal democratic regimes. But scholarship, particularly empirical scholarship that studies American voting behavior, is still dominated by a type of both sidism, which talks in general terms about polarization, partisanship, and technological threat of misinformation to everybody in an effort to appear scientifically neutral. So one of the arguments we make is that the reason why people don't take the argument that we're taking is because it appears to be hard. This matter is a political movement born in and sustained by the new digital public sphere. Certainly disinformation and conspiracy theories circulate in these groups, and some elements have moved in the direction of destructive radicalism. But all empirical evidence suggests that in the 10 years of activism of this group, and even in the face of glacial change and a frustrating lack of responsiveness, Black Lives Matter has not been epistemically compromised by the new digital ecosystem. There's just no comparison. Summer of 2020 saw the largest popular protest in the history of the United States. Far from citizens in silos and echo chambers, an estimated 20 million Americans from across the United States, all with very, very different views, very different backgrounds, mostly, well, a lot of different political views. Of course, there weren't too many people on the far right there, but came out in solidarity with the cause of racial justice. These protests were overwhelmingly peaceful, with property destruction and economic disruption amounting to a small fraction of what right-wing groups have caused with fewer people and in shorter period of time. Disinformation is a right-wing problem. I want to suggest that one reason why it is a right-wing problem is that we have moved past culture wars. Many elements of the right no longer care about mobilizing majorities around issues, which they will sometimes win and sometimes lose on election day. But instead, they now embrace an anti-democratic ideology that targets the democratic system itself. Conclusion. There is no doubt that the digital information explosion has had and will continue to have profound effects on democracy. From campaign strategies to national security, no corner of our political world is immune from the impact of changing communication technology. We have experienced and witnessed mostly negative effects, but academic and popular analysis is mostly gloom and doom narrative. Sorry, both academic and popular analysis has been mostly a gloom and doom narrative with a certain amount of nostalgia for the lost gatekeepers of the past. Purposes of optimism and hope that sees some innovative potential for democracy in a digital age. But we do not share that optimism and hope. Our new digital ecosystem poses very serious, potentially devastating dangers for democracy. But we have argued that those dangers can be traced back to political actors who exploit the new technology, not to make money, but to really explicitly undermine democracy. In some ways, we are facing today a familiar and old authoritarian tactic of seeking to weaken the power of information, fact, and criticism, which is to say the power of citizens to hold states to account, state actors to account. But they have new weapons and unprecedented access to our new digital public sphere. The speed, volume, and reach of digital communication, as opposed to its algorithmic curation, the speed, volume, and reach of digital communication is unprecedented. So yes, technology is part of the problem. We should document them, expose, and challenge abuses within the digital public sphere. As we have tried to argue, here the solution will involve more than technological regulation. No amount of platform content moderation will be able to fully thwart disinformation campaigns undertaken by powerful people. Vibrant, well-functioning public sphere is anathema to authoritarianism. The digitalization of the public sphere has meant that authoritarians do not need to directly suppress the public sphere. They can instead wreck it, so that it's more difficult for all of us to engage in. What this in turn has meant is the blossoming of serious authoritarian threats within democracies. Hiding behind the charade of free speech and pointing to votes and majorities, these agents do not need to engage in brute suppression. They can effectively, they can be as effective through disinformation tactics. Many of these tactics are unstoppable through regulation and transparency. They are not algorithms controlling our lives. These are political agents with agendas. It is the man and not the machine that we need to worry about. To get back to our technology thing. Thank you very much.
Much. Many challenging ideas. Until the very end, I thought, well, I think I have some substantial disagreements. And then at the end, I wasn't sure that the substantial, or maybe I'm.
You always have a disagreement.
You convinced me, maybe at the end. But we still have at least 30 minutes for discussion, so plenty of time. Anyone? Yeah, Catherine.
Hi, very nice to see you. Thanks for the great paper. So I have a question, because actually one of our PhD students has actually just written an article, which I had to read in the class, in which he did a study that found that that people right-wing or self-identify as right-wing are more willing to accept lies in order to advance, agenda, whatever, economy, for example. Anyway, so I think there's a lot of, empirical probably evidence for some of the things you're saying. But the question I had was a little bit about the difference in the elite group that is intentionally trying to wreck the public sphere and undermine democracy, and people who are far right, or at least are now labeled as far right, and sort of what their intentions are. In a way, I mean, it doesn't seem to me that they necessarily, like sort of the ordinary, far right person, is necessarily out to destroy democracy. It seems that they're more susceptible, however, to cynicism, because they don't think that there is any truth, right? And also it seems like they also lack trust in basic institutions. And so I guess the question is, to me, like the remedy seems to be to inoculate these people from the intentional designs of, the elites who are exploiting their insecurities and doubts. And that then leads to me to this very political question, right, of how you then assist the that have to do with things like shoring up, so I guess what I'm saying is it's kind of not just a failure of these bad actors. It seems to me to be a failure of actually historically existing democratic institutions. Like in the United States, especially, I remember, when September 11th happened, for example, and how Saddam Hussein was blamed for September 11th, which then justified the war in Iraq. Like, so when did America become, authoritarian? It's hard to answer, I think, as a question. So I guess what I'm saying is, you didn't need Trump to get to the point where people lost faith in like their elected leaders, democratic institutions, their actual, truth telling, the lack of accountability of media to hold leaders to account. So to me, it's not like a new phenomenon, but I feel like things like the financial crisis, a lot of things like probably left a lot of people, in very difficult circumstances. And in a way, like it's not inconceivable that they would sort of lose sight of the fact that democracy is meaningful. This is what makes them then very susceptible to these problems of the elite, right? But I just want to say, like, I think there's two different kinds of problems there, and I'd love to hear more about what your remedy is for that group.
I just asked, what do you do about it? So do I answer it? Sure. Okay, so that's a great question. I don't have a full answer, but one of the things I do like to do is I like to compare. African Americans in the United States, right, have really had a hard time. And they have had institutions that have not lived up to so many ways. I don't even have to begin. And yet you do not see the problem of disinformation within the political movements of African Americans. You do not see this kind of anti-democratic. You do not even see, this kind of thinking the vote is all a sham anyway. So one of the things that I'm interested in, I'm always interested in looking at things comparatively. Why is the United States in this pathology? And I was following the election in Germany, right? They had a little bit of misinformation, all concentrated on like a really crazy right wing, but really didn't go much further. So looking at why United States is in this pathology and some other places and not in Europe. Why is the African American community, which has been disappointed over and over and over again, does not have these kinds of problems? And I don't have an answer, but one dimension of it in the United States is, we were also talking about it at lunch, is that the demographics are changing. And the Republican Party really has two options, and it's kind of divided. One option is that actually it starts changing its agenda to speak to the demographics, to continue to win elections. And the other is to say, you know what, elections aren't really that important. What's most important is that we maintain this kind of truth in power. And so we're willing to undermine elections. We're willing to do redos in order to stay in power because we're in some kind of an existential crisis. And here, I really do think that there are people in the Republican Party who have decided that democratic institutions or democracy is, they have really been fabricating this in their base. And so you can see this problem from all sorts of different angles. I'm primarily looking at it from an elite issue, and I'm primarily doing that because I don't think people have looked at it enough. It's either a platform issue, or there's something. These poor people have they have this terrible life, and they have reason to be pissed off. But I point out there's all these other people who have even more reason to be pissed off, and they're not going in that direction. So that's not really a solution, but.
I may, Justin, I think there is evidence that people in marginalized communities like the Black community do have problems, for example, with COVID vaccine uptake because of historical mistreatment, right, through the state. So I think it's not on the same issue area of elections. And I guess there I don't know enough about empirically like how marginalized groups vote, and whether or not they have like any faith in at least Indigenous peoples. I think there's a lot of divide in terms of participation in Canadian politics. Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. Like I think it's a great argument about how it's not the technology, but there when you say it's the man, I want to know, like, yes, there's the problem of the elites, and like that's a classic problem, right? Of how you stop people who just want to gain political power for their own private gain. And you'd think that it'd be a no-brainer that we would see that and stop them, and yet we have people, voting for them. So we go back all the way to the end, right? But or to the beginning, I should say. So I'm kind of more interested in, like, if we're a democracy, we've got to figure out how to get people to see, like, what is worth saving, and we've got to inoculate them from these people who are basically trying to manipulate them, right? And so I guess I think you have opened up a great agenda to take us off this question that it's just about fixing the algorithm. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. So people who are following on Zoom, please let us know, raise your virtual hand if you want to ask a question. Danielle, you're next on the list.
Yeah, so thank you. That was a great talk and very thought-provoking. And so in a way, your conclusion sort of is kind of theoretically reassuring, because it means in a certain sense that there's nothing that new under the sun. It's not like we have to deal with this, oh my God, I don't understand what an algorithm is really, and I have to find a way of preventing it from destroying democracy, So it's basically about, so I was surprised that, or maybe this was deliberate, that through your talk, if I'm mistaken, you did utter the P word, which is populism, right? Which is a big, so, one of the things that, so it seems to me that if you compare a place like Canada and the United States, talking about comparison, right? One of the things that happened in 2016, which you named as a sort of a watershed moment, is that Trump got elected, right? And Trump got elected partly because of stuff that was happening online, but he became then an accelerator, right? That you got this phenomenon happening where all of a sudden Trump was feeding the beast, and and so it seems like what happened in 2016 in the United States is that a bad man in this particular sense, who was committed to the erosion of democratic institutions, got elected, right? And so I wonder if you have, and to the surprise of a lot of people, I mean, there are a lot of people who fairly late in the game, thought that there's no way that the Republican Party, an institution, not a fringe institution, but an institution with a long, history in the United States that is not one not one that I share, but that is respectable, and sort of got hijacked by someone who was sort of seemingly dismissive of democratic institutions and safeguards of anyway. So I wonder whether part of the agenda should not be to sort of look at the ways in which sort of institutions have become vulnerable in ways perhaps that they weren't before the rise of these kinds of people. I mean, you look at, I as somebody who situates himself on the left, I'm a little bit less sanguine than you about when you look about the role of somebody like Corbyn in the UK with respect to Brexit. I'm not convinced that there isn't a little bit of a soul searching to be done amongst institutions or parties that are more on the left. So you have a kind of a slightly befuddled look on your face.
No, sorry.
Wonder whether,
concentrating.
whether this is making any sense Friday afternoon after a long week.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether part of if it's about bad people, then it's not just about bad people existing. It's about there perhaps in a greater proportion, or a certain kind of bad person in a greater proportion, being enabled to achieve power in institutions like parties that not fringe parties, but taking over central parties and then bending them to their wills. And whether there's anything that we should be doing that involves safeguards at that level. Thinking about how it is that certain things have been. I'll just give you an example, right? So I read this book, I can't remember her name, a woman who then went on to create a super PAC. Maybe there's somebody in the room who knows her name, who said, you know what? Weird thing about the Republican Party is, in a sense, it's more democratic than the Democratic Party because the role of super delegates is not as strong as the Democratic Party, right? So they, there was nothing in the party that allowed them to prevent Trump from rising. Whereas, the super delegates of the Democratic Party, basically did that to Sanders, to arguably.
Right.
And that might seem like a bad thing, but maybe it's not. It's kind of a thing,
Okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, the bottom line is the number of Republicans who refused to certify the election on January 6th. I mean, it's so. I mean, it's not really that there were sections of the Republican Party that really don't care about elections, and so, but back to your left and right. So I really want to follow the election in Brazil. So the election of Bolsonaro is going to use every single disinformation campaign to undermine every possibility that the outcome is not him win. But I'm interested in whether the other side uses exactly the same tactics. Hypothesis is not that it won't. That Bolsonaro will use it. That there is a good chance that he won't win, but he will. And the more there's a chance he won't win, the more that he's going to question the outcome of the procedures. And what we are seeing is this attempt, and the reason why I don't use populism is that what the aspect of these people that I'm most interested in is the way they're using authoritarianism within democracy. What they want to do is they want to get elected and then they want to stay elected. So they want to get elected and then they want to fix the system so they appear to be majority elected legitimate rulers, but they rig the system so they can never get unelected or nobody else can get elected, or if they don't get elected then it's always a fraud, and they do this through disinformation, and there, of course, how it works and where it works depends on a lot of complicated things having to do with stuff that for the people who you're going to be manipulating and what are their issues and so on. But ultimately, it's a tactic about hollowing out democracy that's opened up through the possibility of this very typical type of disinformation, primarily polarization and the attack on democratic procedures, but some of these others. And I guess I do see it, I do see it as attached to authoritarianism. I mean, of course, Venezuela has left-wing authoritarianism. So, I mean, I'm not saying authoritarianism is only on the right, but it is attached to authoritarianism that is this new authoritarians, who are authoritarians within democracies.
In the back.
Oh, me. Thank you for the talk. So I wanted to push back against the targeting of bad actors as such. So I put a little sketch on your problematization.
Can you speak up just a bit?
Sure. I wanted to push back on your targeting of bad actors as such. And I put a little sketch on what your problem of social media looks like.
Okay.
Right? So say P1, social media only amplifies information. Only amplifies.
Say that.
Sorry?
Okay.
P2, distinctly social media opens access to the domestic public sphere to foreign actors. P3, bad foreign actors produce and spread misinformation. Social media is problematic by bad foreign actors. My pushback is something like foreign actors come out from that problematization as your target, in part because of what seems like a relatively thin account of what social media does, and that is only amplify information. Right?
I didn't say only amplify information, sorry. And if I did, I take it back, but.
But you had the analogy of a megaphone, right?
So it really is true that Trump and Fox News were the biggest source of, so they weren't hidden trolls, right? They're not these people somewhere, they weren't that kind of fake news. They were upfront, saying it out loud. And so in this case, it was amplified. But I perfectly admit, right, that all, I mean, I am on every social media you could possibly imagine, and every piece of information I get is 100% curated. How do they know that I want that shoes? So all the information is curated. And it's curated for profit. It's not curated for democracy. So I'm 100% on that. I didn't want to claim, I know how social media works, but my point is that we actually we can actually get a bit of a handle on these and we can start asking questions about what's being upranked? Why is it being upranked? What are the algorithms, right? So that's only, so I didn't want to say only, like all of social media is only a megaphone at all.
Okay. That's a first clarification. My pushback would go further and say something like echo chamber effects are in part drawn from incentives to make profits by social media companies to keep people on the platform, right? That there were previously plenty of news sources that are right-wing and wanting to polarize. Social media is an excellent environment for people to neutralize already as such. And if that's the account, then bad actors are just a nudge, sort of significant extreme push, right? Targeting of bad actors is interesting, but it seems strange to me to have an account of the way Facebook, for instance, works, and then go, it's interesting, it's a problem that they don't have democratic values. Zuckerberg is not so interested in accountability. Solution is something like nationalize Facebook. Make it, yeah, okay.
Okay, so my issue, explaining platforms, my issue is disinformation, right? So you can see this as a platform problem, and I do think it is a platform problem. It is a platform problem, but my argument is that we can actually pressure these platforms into being better actors, right? And because we acknowledge that they are actually performing a function, an information function, a public sphere that they didn't actually anticipate, right? They just thought it was going to be, like a social network. But they're actually giving people information, and so there are ways in which we can force them, because they all want to be this, force them to have better structures. But if you, and by bad actors, I mean this in the technical, I don't mean like, maybe they are evil people, but I just meant they have intentions that are, so I'm looking at the agents who have intentions. Even with the best restructured Facebook, which in 10 years, Facebook is, I probably won't even be here, but anyway, they still are going to be able to use disinformation, right? So, and there really is a lot of empirical evidence out there that echo chambers and filter bubbles, whatever they're called, are really not a thing. Like, they're not created by algorithms. They are. So for example, it turns out that the more you know about politics, right? The higher you up, the more likely you are to be in an echo chamber, because it is a consumer choice of information as opposed to a curational, effect of algorithms. And so again, we have to go back to this idea that people are making choices, people have agendas, people have strategies, and we have to reintroduce this into the narrative as opposed to it being this kind of black box of algorithms and platforms. But I don't want to say, yeah.
Last,
Charge.
quick, the last point. But then it's unclear to me why the targeting is still only bad actors. You might say even the best structured Facebook will still have bad actors, but an unstructured Facebook will still have bad actors, and you can target bad actors for a very long time. And I'm not sure that's an eliminable problem as such.
Yeah.
Facebook, governance of Facebook is a structural thing that you can deal with.
So they're always going to be bad. Okay, so my conclusion actually is the problem is a political problem, right? So the kind of metaphor for the paper, it was unelecting Trump, not deplatforming it. So we have to actually see this as a political problem. We have to, I'm sorry, we all have to vote Democrat. I mean, really, and that's, saying that is a partisan thing to say, but the Republican Party appears to have been taken over by groups that really don't care so much about democracy. Or when does the Republican Party, get so bad that you really have to say? So I just want to return disinformation, and something. It's a matter of balance, right? So again, this was conceived 1.5 years ago, where really everybody was in a panic about the platforms, about algorithms. Everyone was watching The Social Dilemma, which I hate this movie, right? It sensationalizes, and so when originally conceived, it was just trying to kind of right the balance. Now, particularly when the empirical evidence has come out about the 2020 election and the role of Fox and so it's really kind of, but not to say that there are still, of course, problems on Facebook. But the other thing is the obsession with Facebook. So Facebook, first of all, it's like young people. What is that? What is Facebook? They're not on Facebook. It's desperate meta, the metaverse. Where's that going to go? So I mean. It's really, it seems hard to imagine because it's got so many, billions of, but I don't think Facebook is going to have such a long life. I mean, we really are at the beginning. We're going to have a whole, YouTube is where actually, YouTube, TikTok.
That's true. Yes.
Hi, thank you for the speech. So I'll begin my questions from my personal experience. So I'm Cantonese. Back in the Hong Kong independence movement in 2019. So I have lots of relatives in Hong Kong, and they feel many videos to me that like how some protesters attack the police, like arrows, knife, or even homemade fire bombs. But I haven't seen any of this kind of information or videos on Twitter. And I have lots of Chinese friends. They try to post these videos information on Twitter, but their accounts got shut down for to the tell them like, can you are spreading this information or being verified as robots? And me myself, my accounts got shut down just because I like scheming work on the topic on Hong Kong. Right. So my question is like, those people are like, these people like who categorized in the group government by so-called authoritarian government or non-democracy government, marginalized or even devoiced by the Western medias or the medias on the side of democracy. And
sorry, what is it? Just the last part of the question?
So like those people who categorize in a group like government by the authoritarian government or non-democracy government, are marginalized or even devoiced by the Western medias or the medias on the side of democracy.
Okay, what? So the question, I see the problem, but I still don't know that. But you're saying that mainstream media is not taken seriously enough,
Well, the people like from the non
discounting people under their
Oh,
yeah.
do you think that's happening?
Yeah, sure. That's what I'm experiencing, like for a very long time.
I mean, that could be. So I do think that all authoritarian governments are using, I mean, they always have used disinformation. And I think, you know, the digital public sphere is just made it this disinformation even more. So they use it in all sorts of ways, I think. But okay, so first of all, I don't think mainstream, well, I'm still not sure about the question. So, but okay, let me step back. So one of the things I am saying is that there are a lot of problems with our digital public sphere right now. There's a lot of information pollution. There's a lot of problems with, but I'm kind of taking the long-term view. That is, we're really in this situation, really hands-on thinking about it for 6 years. And we still have a long way to go to understand in which information in the digital age is affecting democratic action, relations of citizens to states, and so on. So this is not to say that there are a lot of pathologies and problems out there. But my claim is only that I don't think we should look at those problems as impossible systemic problems having to do with technology that's just going to, you know, crush our soul. That it's a new technology. It's like we were talking at lunch, you know, when the radio and television, everyone thought, oh my God, that's the end of democracy, because it's going to have this immediate effect on people's emotions. It's all going to be Hitler on the radio, and we're all going to be, you know, maybe it did undermine some you know, level of rationality in the public sphere, but so I guess on the part of technology, it's kind of a wimpy thing. I'm saying it's really too early for us to say that information of our political communication is, you know, they're just undermine democracy. But it's not clear that I have answers to, you know, very specific, say, problems or pathologies that arise. Abuses.
So it's very interesting and clear. Question is, so when you use the term bad actors, you don't mean bad necessarily in an ethical sense.
No.
You mean like bad in a political sense. If you're a defender of democracy, then bad actors want to undermine democracy. Is that?
So bad actor is a technical term and actually rational choice, social choice. So I mean it more in that. So it's a spoiler, right? So it's somebody who, like, if you're kind of assuming people are going to act in a certain way, then you have these actors who actually are not going to play the game, who want to spoil the game. So I don't mean it that they're evil and horrible. Actually, I've got this question before. I realized maybe I shouldn't use the bad actor. It's kind of type of argument that I meant to appeal to, as opposed to me making a comment on their, you know, horrible people.
I mean, to some degree, there are bad actors that are bad, and liars or hypocrites, which is kind of,
Yeah, so it's not that kind of bad actor.
No, I know, but I mean, some of the bad actors are
yeah.
that. But
Some of the good actors are also.
Yes, of course. But some. You talked about the fact that perhaps discrimination or suffering doesn't explain why a group might be more susceptible to problems. And you said, you know, the African American community in the United States, other right-wing groups are. Question is, so does it mean that it's like, what kind of fault is it? Is it a moral fault? Is it a prudential fault to fall to the lies vehicled in the public sphere and the digital sphere? And does the digital age change, you know, what it means to be wrong? Like, is it more? Are you more guilt? Are you more moral? Are you more? Sorry. Blameworthy during the digital age where it's easy to get information, or are you less blameworthy because it's easier to get misinformation?
I don't really have an answer to that. I mean, so I'm talking about propaganda and manipulation. So I do believe a lot of people are manipulated. And this actually goes back to Catherine's. So one of the interesting things, right, is that a lot of African Americans were vaccine hesitant, but there were no elites that were weaponizing it, right? So the right that was vaccine hesitant, it all of a sudden becomes a political thing. They're going to vote people out of office because they're vaccine hesitant. And that wasn't the case in the African American community, because there weren't these elites that were then, you know, polarizing and politicizing it. So I am looking at elites who manipulate. Now, of course, it's a question of how is it that they, you know, what is happening with these people that they are manipulatable? I'm mostly interested in excluding some things. So I really dislike political psychology arguments because, you know, it's human bias and we're all, you know, we can't make judgments anyway. And this is just, you know, the whole citizen competency thing. They love the digital aids because they can kind of double down on citizen incompetence. But again, like if we're all subject to these biases, why is it that one group like has all this cognitive bias, but you know, and I don't really have that really. So I'm just looking at the manipulation, the elite manipulation and propaganda, and also making the claim that it's not just to win the next election. They really want it so that the system is undermined so that they will continue to win undemocratically.
On the level that this is not a technological problem and it's more of a political problem, I want to ask a question about how to characterize this political problem exactly. Have to vote with the Democratic Party, now the Republican Party, and that makes me think, how exactly can Democratic Party win? I think my question goes somewhat back to Catherine's concerns about, you know, maybe human psychology and how voters think about and the ethics of campaigning. And so you ground your theory and you ground your paper on Habermasian's theory of political communication. I mean, I've been influenced people to win in politics is to take the high road, to be Habermasians, to foster the norm of accuracy or truth. Because in this paper you've been saying, okay, this information is bad, and I think we can think about what kind of this information is unethical, impermissible in political communication, and what type is permissible during on the campaign trails. And then you say manipulation is bad and misrepresentation is bad. Yes, I see all these political acts of communication can be bad on the Habermasian account. People like Eric Bierbaum and Russell Muir have been saying, right, maybe we have to take the low road and maybe manipulation and misrepresentation in some domains and under some circumstances are permissible because the core, the normative core of political of communication is actually very minimal. And so your talk kind of provokes me to think along these lines again. Is Habermasian account of deliberate democracy the proper, set of ideal for citizens and also politicians and for our political representatives to follow? Right.
Okay, so a small little story. So when I graduated from McGill, I went to work to write speeches for a member of parliament. And there was some economic crisis and the budget was coming down. And my member of parliament said, you know, people are really, it's really hard for people to, you know, make ends meet. And I bet you all people are eating dog food. Like in my, so go out to the constituency and see if you could find people who are, you know, so poor, who are old, who are on some fixed income, who are eating dog food. So I did some research. I mean, I couldn't find anybody who's eating dog food. But then she said, well, they could be eating dog food. I said, look, so write me a speech in which there are people in the constituency eating dog food. And I said, but I didn't actually find anybody. But she said, I know that they're poor enough that they probably are. So that was one of the things that convinced me to go do a PhD. So much. She was on the right side of everything. It was great, but I really didn't like the having to write down that the old people were eating dog food when we had no evidence that they were eating dog food. So that kind of, you know, okay. That's where I stand. But what I do see now, because I'm doing kind of democratic theory, is that there are more and more people who are kind of going into a realist camp. So look, politics is about, it's about power struggles, and they have power. And so we actually have to also understand that it's power struggles. This is not a moral sphere. And so if they're going to use these tactics, we also have to use these tactics. And I'm not a realist, and so I'm realistic, so I think politicians lie all the time. I think Democrats lie as much as Republicans. I think there's some imaginary line that is what I call radicalization, in which you cross a line about how you, particularly the rules of democracy, how you're willing to bend those in order to win or to stay in power. Some have this imaginary line that most Democrats, but not all of them, are on one side, and some Republicans are on the other side. But I don't kid myself that the Democrats are also, they're politicians, they all lie. And I think Habermas doesn't have a view of politics that we're going to have this beautiful public sphere where everyone is going to be a moral agent and only say the truth or anything like that. He thinks that the public sphere is a big, messy, chaotic, but it's important that it's pluralistic. It's important that you have a lot of voices, that you have opposition. These authoritarians don't want. They don't like opposition. They don't like criticism. They want to undermine this function of a kind of free-for-all public sphere where all sorts of ideas come up. And that's anti-democratic. And one of the underlying arguments here is that just having elections is not enough for democracy. You have this public sphere full of pluralistic contestation in order to have a democracy. And that's and so it's people who think, that it's anti-democratic because it thwarts the will of the people. This kind of gets back to the populism. Is kind of where I draw the line. But I really don't want to imply that the Democratic Party is like the morally high ground party. And also, I was being a bit facetious because I actually really should also all register to be Republicans. And Republicans do actually have a very democratic internal system in which we all register for the primaries and we make sure that, the Trump candidates don't win. That would actually be probably even better
Can
strategy.
we register as Canadian?
Questions? Jordan?
Great. Thanks very much for the talk. It was great to get the preview over lunch and then now the whole thing. So I agree with the conclusion, right? That the solution will involve more than technological regulation, right? That's not a sufficient condition, right? But I'm wondering how to evaluate the counterfactual here. And I think it'd be interesting to discuss the objections that you might receive in the paper, right? Or deal with in the paper. So I'm wondering, somebody might make an argument like, well, the bad actors are made bad by these perverse incentives, right? And we can just make these perverse incentives go away if we regulate everything, right? We can, so to speak, nudge our way out of disinformation, right? And so I'm wondering, to me, it seems so obvious that I would, if I was to write about this, I would not want to make the claim that the solution is only technological regulation, but I'm suspecting there's some folks in the literature who do think that that is a sufficient condition. And I'm wondering, could you just try to pump those arguments up a little bit here and give us some reason why someone might want to hold those views? They seem on the face of it a bit implausible to me, but I could see somebody going in for the view that the regulation is a sufficient condition.
So I don't think it's a perverse incentive. So I think authoritarians, so one of the things we say is that you have real authoritarians. Let's call Putin a real, okay? And he uses, very, very effective disinformation campaigns. He also, of course, actually puts people in jail and suppresses. So he uses these two different kinds of strategies, right? One is the kind of old-fashioned authoritarianism, and one is the new digital virtual authoritarianism. What you see is in liberal democracies, people taking exactly those strategies, right, and using them within liberal democracies. And so the incentive is to come and stay into power. The incentive is not created by, it's not like, because it's not like a profit incentive, right? It's not like people are saying, oh, I'm going to make more money. So, in 2016, so those teenagers, whatever, in Macedonia, they tried actually both Republicans and Democrats. And it turns out it was only they can only make money on Republicans, right, with the ads and stuff like that. So they gave up on the Democrats. And so it's true that the business model of Facebook created the incentives for them to push fake news. But that's not the same incentive structure of people like Bolsonaro, and because they just are using this as a weapon, but it is a new type of a weapon within liberal democracies to suppress and wreck the public sphere without, to wreck the public sphere without suppressing it. So their incentive has always been the same, like to stay in power. It's just that these authoritarians have not really been able to use information as well. So I guess that's what I would say, but I would still say, so there's an attempt on COVID and also on voter fraud to try to do content moderation on really big whoppers, right? But these people are very smart, but then they won't have big whoppers. They'll have other ways of undermining people's confidence in the outcome of votes, right? I've asked myself, could it really be possible that these are not counted properly? That so now in the United States, we need to have what people. What's the word I'm looking for? People, election. We need to have election observers, right? So we also, that's like the have election observers to make sure that it's fair. It's kind of, and that I know that undermines my confidence in the democratic system. And that's the incentive.
Okay, so I have a quick question and I'd like to provide a counter
An answer
example.
for it. No, sorry.
Well, I'd like to provide a counter example for it. And so my quick question is, I really want to know what your opinion on what if we gave more power to the social media platforms themselves to self-regulate? Because, and my counter example to kind of support this question is I feel like social media can also be used by good actors to support anti-autocratic information. So for example, I'm also from Hong Kong, and I feel like right now the authoritarian government in Hong Kong is kind of like because they have more power over social media, they're censoring what they choose to censor, so that this creates a further divide between the more democratic population and the more pro-establishment population in Hong Kong. Additionally, in places like Russia, we saw Putin move to ban social media platforms such as Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, because the people within Russia were actually spreading information against the authoritarian government in Russia. And so I was just wondering what your opinion would be if we gave more power to these corporations so that they could almost transcend kind of like government censorship, so that in a sense they could give more voice to the people.
Right. So I agree with you. So first of all the people who run these platforms, they're all pro-democracy, right? These are not authoritarian people. They have made decisions. Some of the decisions they made actually did not realize that the consequences of them. Some of them it appears as if they did. So there's profit motives. So there's this incredibly interesting internal debates within them. What is their role and what is their responsibility? And they can be a force for good. Absolutely. Give them more power is that in authoritarian state, it's not clear what kind of power we could give them. Who is we to give them? How are we doing that if they're actually being shut down by the millions of very sophisticated digital authoritarians in these regimes? But I do agree that they can be forces for good. Absolutely, but both mobilization and, again, my example is Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. It was a digital revolution that created the 20 million people coming out. So I don't know about giving them more power. Certainly acknowledging that they can be forces for democracy. Absolutely.
Maybe one more comment from me,
Okay.
and then we'll cut it off. No. Actually, I really like the idea that there's a project here that involves wrecking public sphere and not suppressing it. I find that quite illuminating. What analysis that you're I think that I wonder whether it has to also to come with a kind of downplaying of the negative impacts of technologies. And that's what I feel in maybe in conclusion. Then I wasn't sure anymore that you were downplaying the effects of AI and digital platforms, but I think that you probably do it in the paper, and perhaps adding a dose of social epistemology to the analysis would help maybe rebalancing it. And the premises of social epistemology is that as epistemic, we're not isolated, that we're always into epistemic communities, and these communities have a huge impact on belief formation, opinion formation, and so on. And now with the platforms, it gives us access to many epistemic communities and either misinformation or polarizing discourses will be, plentiful. And so if you have biases, let's say anti-immigration biases or anti-public health measure biases, you can always find discourses, views, content that will reinforce your pre-existing belief. And that I find quite worrisome, as an impact on our democratic life. And but I think that your argument that why is it overwhelmingly on the right, that's a very good point, and I'll have to think about it. But one counterexample, maybe, I'm sure that many of you ended up in that situation during the pandemic. One of my close friends who's not on the right at all, but she comes from the wellness, new spiritualism movement, and she became quite radical in her anti-vax views, and it was impossible to have a rational discussion with her, and she could be reinforced in her belief every day, right? She would find new discourses, and because of the confirmation bias, I know that you don't like psychological analysis, but I think that the confirmation bias do exist. So, these platforms, they seem to exacerbate our epistemic vulnerabilities in a way that I find, difficult to counteract. Yeah. So
right.
In the end, so perhaps that would mean, well, the new technologies, they do create quite difficult challenges with regards to the quality of our democratic life.
Maybe. So first of all, I think, so one of the things that's studied is the effect of social media on polarization. Right? And I think the evidence is still not clear whether actually social media causes or even exacerbates polarization. It's certainly true that there is more and more growing evidence that people are not in echo chambers, or when they are in echo chambers, they choose them, right? So people who have beliefs that are not unpopular, they don't want to hear, right? So they do choose there. So my first point is that, so it's not the algorithms, it's the choices, right? It's easier to insulate yourself from external opinions, but actually it's easier to it's not so much that it's easier to insulate yourself from external opinions, but it is easier to track down the opinions that you want to confirm. But these are your choices, right? And it's not just that the algorithm is like sucking you down the anti-vaxxer hole. Okay. So then the question is whether or not the whole kind of information ontology there, that's what it's doing. I don't know yet. I really don't. First of all, we always focus on Facebook and YouTube, but for example, misinformation, way bigger misinformation source is WhatsApp. So messaging app, completely different, which has had terrible impacts in places like Brazil and India. So there are different kinds of platforms. There's a whole new, these are the optimists out there. People, anybody know the work of Ethan Zuckerman about these new kinds of digital communities that are really positive for democracy. So I guess I think it's early days yet. I do see that there's, we also at lunch, we talked about the social dilemma. So one of the things I don't like about the social dilemma, that movie, is that it sensationalizes and kind of demonizes this digitalization where all our kids are being sucked into this. And I just don't, I think we need to acknowledge, I think we need to know more about it. And I'm not sure we do know yet what it is. So You know, these are, like, I swear, we're gonna look back, maybe I'm too old, maybe I'll be dead by then, but we're gonna look back and think of Facebook as being some arcane, bad first attempt at some, you know, digital platform. We're gonna have a whole new digital platform world in 10 years. Maybe one that has taken all these things into consideration. That sounds like a techno optimist, I know, but it's all just pushback on the techno pessimism.
When my students read your paper, there were some comments about your optimism, I have to say. But thank you so much, Simone. That was
It was
terrific.
a lot of fun. I was saying, it's half my family.